manner in which the evidence leaders and members of the commission approached critical witnesses, particularly Mr. Chippy Sheikh and Advocate Hlongwane, exhibited a complete failure to rigorously test the versions of these witnesses by putting questions to them with the required open and inquiring mind. Given the wealth of allegations contained in material in the possession of the commission against them, it failed to confront these witnesses with these serious allegations, which were made against both in respect of corruption and wrongdoing.
We all heard that reading of the judgment by the Judge President in the North Gauteng High Court, Judge Dunstan Mlambo, announcing that he's overturning the findings of the Seriti Commission, saying it failed to comprehensively investigate the arms deal as it had been mandated to do so. Good evening and welcome. You're watching Unfiltered on SABC 3 and on SABC News Channel 404. My name is Desiree Chauke. To look at the way forward in terms of the usefulness of commissions, we're joined in the studio tonight by Thami Nkosi. He's a protest and surveillance organizer at Right to Know, the other part of the civic organizations that approach the courts to review the commission findings. We're also joined from our Cape Town studio, a very well-known face in terms of fighting this process, Terry Crawford-Brown, an anti-arms deal activist. A very good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, and thank you for having us.
Thami, do you feel vindicated?
Gee, we've been making the noise, I think, for the past 2 decades to simply say we felt the commission was not going to establish what it set out to do. You could see the attitude of the evidence leaders at the time with regards to when people submitted evidence and how they kind of really chugged it out, and it never found its way into the commission in itself and the daily unfolding. Some of us went there, in person. I may look young, but I'm pretty old. So some of us went in there and we could see the posture even within the commission in itself, that in fact there's a process that's not going to take into cognizance what civil society are going to say, is not going to take into cognizance any kind of evidence that is provided to it. Here's a commission that's willing to close rank and actually do the process the way they saw fit, in spite of every other thing that got put into the commission. So we feel very vindicated because we had seen how the process unfolded, and we always felt, hey, this is not going to work.
Terry, you lost a constitutional court bid to have the process, the findings overturned. What do you think changed?
I think there has been a change in climate in the country, and the realization that unless we deal with the issues of corruption, our expectations of a constitutional democracy will be undercut. And hopefully, yes, it's now time to deal with this. It has been the devil throughout our constitutional democracy. Parliament has become a rubber stamp, and all the checks and balances that we anticipated in terms of a constitutional democracy were destroyed by the arms deal. So it's been a long, long saga. Hopefully, it's time to get us back to where we thought we were going.
For the benefit of viewers who weren't there 20 years ago, remind us why you fought so vehemently against this process.
I was appointed by Archbishop Ndungane, the Archbishop of Cape Town, to represent the Anglican Church at the Parliamentary Defence Review during 1996 to 1998. And it was quite unique internationally to have NGOs and civil society represented in something like a defence review. And after 94, we had European governments flocking to South Africa to pressure our government to buy warships and warplanes, which we didn't need and couldn't afford. In fact, the Defence White Paper had said there was no conceivable foreign military threat to South Africa. The threat was poverty, the legacies of poverty inherited from the apartheid era. I come to this from a banking background, and when the arms companies began to talk about, you spend 30 billion rand on warships and warplanes, and they will invest back 110 billion in offset benefits that will create 65,000 jobs to stimulate the economy. I smelled a rat then. So I wrote and spoke extensively at that time, back in the 90s, that offsets are simply a scam to promoted by the armaments industry, albeit with the collusion of corrupt politicians to fleece the taxpayers. And that has now been proved. And sadly, when people in Parliament, when parliamentarians and even the Auditor General asked how these offsets work, they were blocked by the Department of Trade and Industry on the spurious argument that these offset contracts were commercially confidential. Now we have seen that the offsets were simply a scam. They were a vehicle to pay bribes, and they never materialized.
Why were you so adamant?
Because if we don't deal with corruption, our constitutional democracy will collapse. I was involved in the struggle issues in the 1980s with Archbishop Tutu, where we launched the banking sanctions campaign in 1985. And it's generally acknowledged now, including by President Mandela, that banking sanctions in New York were really the most significant strategy against the apartheid government, which led then to President de Klerk's announcement in February 1990, releasing Mr. Mandela, and the constitutional negotiations that followed. So, yeah, I've been involved since the 1980s with the Anglican Church in hopefully overcoming the era of apartheid, and subsequently that the struggle would be honored, and that we could then rebuild the country.
Thami, you've had a week to digest this outcome. I suppose you go back to the drawing board now to say what now?
I think it's twofold. One, I think, is going back to the drawing board as civil society organizations with regards to how do we further pursue the interests, the public interests, in ensuring that people are held accountable. But the other flip side of the coin is it's interesting that there's checks and balances. As my fellow guest has mentioned, the checks and balances, which simply means we have law enforcement agencies to protect the Constitution, to hold people accountable, and the other question is, how do we strengthen these institutions to actually go out there and do the work that they set out to do, to protect our democracy, to protect our Constitution? So I think it's a twofold thing for me. One of the processes that we engaged in as civil society organization, thanks to Open Secrets, was to convene what we call the People's Tribunal. And this was a conversation with communities, across the length and breadth of the country, poor communities, marginalized communities, and civil society organizations, to have a people's tribunal to simply say, let's reflect on every other thing that has happened in our government. How far have we come as a society? What could still be lacking? And corruption was one of the biggest things that was actually robbing South Africans of a better life. And this is just part of the conversation that we've been having in the longer term, to simply say even the arms deal in itself is but one other element that has actually deprived South Africans of a better life. So for us, it's about bringing those voices from the grassroots to simply actually amplify them, put them into the public discourse, and demand that, sections of society, particularly the law enforcement agencies, for example, Chapter 9 institutions, actually do what they set out to do. We know there was a political idea to kind of erode all these institutions. We know the infiltration that happened or the weakening of the NPA in itself. And I don't think it was a coincidence. If you look at it, there's a common thread. There's a movie called Chaos, and it simply says in every little aspect, everything is related. So it was not an accident that, our then former president tried to cripple the NPA. Our then former, president went into the State Security Agency and used that as his own piggy bank to actually go after his own political enemies. So in essence, we need to look at the holistic picture and simply say there has been a project to weaken state organs, to concentrate power into the hands of a few political, heads, and to simply misinform the public with regards to some of the happenings that are happening. So for us, it's important that even Judge Mlambo put this across to simply say, hold on, we're going to, so for us, it's a victory again for participatory democracy, for active citizenry, to say we're going to speak truth to power, and we're going to demand that power be held accountable.
We're having a conversation about that judgment by Judge Dustin Mlambo, where he overturned the outcomes of the Seriti Commission. We'll continue this conversation with Thami Nkosi and Terry Crawford-Brown when we return from this break.